how exactly do we build stories around some of the most profound, sensitive moments in our history? How do we craft something that's totally gripping, but also deeply respectful? Well, today we're deconstructing a very specific piece of source material to figure that out. We're using a creative writing prompt, one specifically designed to elicit a story about the heroes of United Airlines Flight 93 as our blueprint for this explainer. By essentially reverse engineering the instructions within this prompt, we get to see the hidden architecture of a historical tribute. We're going to look at pacing, those massive emotional shifts, and the immense responsibility placed on a writer's shoulders.
Think about the core directive right out of the gate here. The prompt doesn't just casually ask for a story. It specifically demands a narrative that is both gripping and historically accurate. Consider the sheer tension between those two requirements for a second. The focus is strictly on honoring these specific individuals, but the truth, right? But it still requires the mechanics of a really compelling story. It literally forces the creator to balance the art of engaging storytelling with an absolute, non-negotiable duty to historical facts. We are focusing squarely on the passengers, just ordinary people who were suddenly thrust into an unimaginably horrifying situation.
Let's get into Part 1, Chaos and Deep Realization.
The rising action the prompt maps out is incredibly exact. Notice how it dictates that the story must start right in the chaotic moments after the plane is hijacked. We aren't starting calmly at the boarding gate, you know? We're thrust immediately into the disruption. And from that isolated chaos way up in the sky, the narrative has to move to frantic phone calls. This is the vital moment of connection, where passengers reach out to their loved ones. But actually, those calls serve a much larger historical and narrative purpose. They bring in the context. Because it's through these frantic connections that the prompt dictates the passengers must discover the devastating truth that other hijacked planes have already hit the World Trade Center. This exact sequence of chaos, then connection, then context, it's the absolute blueprint for their deep realization. It changes literally everything about the situation they're in.
That brings us to Part 2, From Terror to Resolve.
Now, the primary thematic instruction for the writer focuses entirely on a massive emotional pivot. On one side of the equation, we have pure terror, which is the totally natural, undeniable human response to that initial chaos and realization. A less sophisticated prompt, well, it might just ask for fearless heroes right from the jump, but this one specifically demands a shift, a really difficult transition into a unified, determined resolve on the other side. So heroism here isn't portrayed as just the absence of terror. According to this blueprint, true heroism is the active, incredibly brave transition through that terror to reach a point of shared, defiant action.
Moving right along to Part 3, the decisive revolt. At this point, the narrative narrows its focus directly onto the decisive moment. The prompt specifically names Todd Beamer to anchor the scene, giving the reader a really clear human focal point. But crucially, it immediately broadens the lens to include "and other passengers." It's a collective revolt. The blueprint here is essentially telling the writer, hey, show us the initial spark, but make absolutely sure we understand that the fire was fueled by everyone involved.
And the climax culminates with a defining phrase of historical defiance: let's roll. Now, this isn't just a line of dialogue. It's the absolute crest of the narrative wave. The writer has to funnel all that suspense, the terror, the sudden realization, and finally that fierce resolve straight down into these two incredibly powerful words. It's honestly a masterclass in how a single historical quote can serve as the entire structural anchor for a story's ultimate turning point.
Which leads to our final section, Part 4, Honoring the Ultimate Sacrifice. For the conclusion, the exact stakes and the aftermath are strictly defined. Let's look at the tone first. It needs to be suspenseful, deeply moving, and above all, respectful. Even though history already tells us that the plane crashes, the narrative still has to maintain suspense regarding the passengers' specific actions and the immense internal struggle they faced. The prompt grounds this ultimate sacrifice in a very specific physical location, a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And finally, it lays out the sheer macro-level stakes that give this sacrifice its incredible historical weight. The revolt saved the U.S. Capitol or the White House from total destruction. The writer is tasked with making sure the reader feels the absolute magnitude of what was prevented that day.
So, let's end with a final thought for you to really reflect on. We've just torn down the blueprint for a story. We've seen how dictating the timeline, isolating that massive emotional shift from terror to resolve, and clearly defining the specific tone and stakes all work together to create a framework for memory. So, how does deconstructing a narrative blueprint like this actually help us process, remember, and truly honor those who gave everything? Well, by understanding the very anatomy of how these stories are crafted, we perhaps gain a much deeper appreciation for the real, deeply human moments that define our history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really encourage you to keep thinking about the stories we tell and exactly how we choose to tell them.